From this perspective, we interpret each house in terms of its relationship to its closest angle, right? So we talked about what the four angles are: the ascendant, the self, the descendant, the other. IC is the roots. Midheaven is your goals or your aims, where you're headed towards, right? So, for example, if the ascendant and the first house represent the self, the incarnation of spirit on earth, right? That's the first house, how you come into this world. The second house is below the self, right? So it provides the foundations for the self. It's what we stand on. You can think of it that way, which is why the second house is the house of our resources. It's the house of money, possessions, stuff, but also our talents, skills, energy. It's our resources, right? So it describes qualities we're ready to harness to feed and support the self, right? The first house. Um, Whereas the 12th house, it's beyond the self, right? It represents what's above the ego, what we can't see. It's our blind spots, our unconscious. It's also the elevated part of ourself, right? So our hidden potential that's waiting to be integrated, right? It's also literally what's above the body. So our spirit, right? Our higher transcendent self, which is why you'll often hear the 12th house talked about as the house of spirituality, right? So just kind of by thinking about what that angle is and the relative position of these two, you immediately get a sense of how these link together. Now, let's look at another angle. So, for example, the descendant, right? That one, as we mentioned, it marks the seventh house, and this is the house of the other, right? Classically speaking, when you want to analyze someone's marriage partner, you look at their seventh house, right? Or their primary relationships, primary one-on-one relationships. So this is the seventh house is the house where we're aiming to find equality, where we're aiming to find that balance with the self, right? It's me versus the other. So we already talked about that axis in general. But now we can think about how the sixth house is below the other, right? It shows where we feel we are below the other, which is why this is a house that's associated with work and service. It's where we feel we need to put in effort, right? Where we need to prove our worth so we can feel equal to the other. Meanwhile, the eighth house, it's on top of the descendant. And it shows where we move on to the next level of relationships into deep intimacy, trust, often unspoken power. It also shows where we feel we've done more than our fair share in relationships, which is why it can show a sense of entitlement or a lack of entitlement to other people's resources. That's why this is the house that you'll often hear described as the house of other people's resources, shared resources, assets, inheritance. So it's got this kind of so it grows off of the seventh, right? It's above the seventh, but it's the resources that come as a consequence of the relationships. It's also the house where we delve deeper into our understanding of relationships and human nature, right? It's this is why it's a house also associated with the esoteric, right? It's where we explore the mysteries and complexities that go beyond the surface. And then we can do that with the other two, right? So the IC is the bottom point of the chart, right? So that's our baseline, like we talked about. It's our roots, home, comfort. Um, and so the third house comes before the roots. So it represents everything that happens before we find our roots in the fourth house. We have a really nice analogy in the material of like when you first put a cat into a new house, right? You'll find that they go and roam around in every single corner and kind of, get a feeling for it before they could establish that sense of home. That's the third house. It's kind of like where we're moving around and kind of getting oriented around who's our neighbor, who's, our siblings. It's like what's around us, right? Third house. And then once you've kind of established that, then you can go into the fourth. And then the fifth, that's comes after the fourth house. So it represents everything that happens after we find our roots and a sense of safety in the fourth house. This is the house where we create. So you often hear about this house described as a house of creative expression, but it's where we create everything we create, including our children. It's also the house of children for that reason. So once you've got that sense of home, then this one comes afterwards. It's also the house where we find joy, self-expression, pleasure, right? This is the fun house, presumably, although it depends on what planets you have in there and what sign it's in. But it's where we find joy, hobbies, romantic partners, right? So, angle theory, really interesting way to think about and I forgot you the top one, to think about the different houses. It's just another kind of anchor and way to remember the meaning of the houses. So, if the midheaven is our career, the ninth house is all the preparation that we want to put into before we get to our career. This is why we often associate it with the house of higher learning, right? But it's more than that, right? It's where you broaden your perspective, right? And where you kind of create an opening and or you fill it with knowledge or philosophies that then will feed into where you want to go in life, midheaven. And then the 11th house after your career, right? After the aims. And so the 11th house represents this house. I like how the ancient astrologers talk about it as the house of hopes and dreams. It's everything that happens after we grow into the best version of ourselves, hopefully, 10th house, and we discover our vocation. And the 11th house, we feel the drive to share and implement that vision, often in a group of like-minded people, right? But the 11th house is it's where we want to it's where we're a little less focused on personal ambition, right? And what we want to get out of it, like how we want to share that with the world.